Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books. Yes, I'm back, and as promised, I'm going to talk about Eversion by Alastair Reynolds. I've just finished it. Yes, I binge read it like the entire day, and this is very much my very first impressions. I hope my opinions won't change to the worse afterwards, but right now I'm still very hyped from the whole thing. So I know I said this will not be a review because I don't do reviews, so I'll call it a discussion and we'll do the usual thing, right? I'll first give a bit of a synopsis as far as I can without spoilers and tell you all why you really should go out and read it as fast as possible. And then I'll have a bit of a drink and you'll all go out and read the book. It's not that long, you can do that. And then we'll talk about why it's so fantastic, alright? Shall we do that? Yes! Cheers! I know, that's not exactly the point where I did the spoiler-free review part, but don't worry. Okay, so Eversion is a standalone novel by Alastair Reynolds, one of the most, how to say this, consistently fantastic classic sci-fi authors of that are still around at this point. And yeah, it comes like not even a year after his last one, Inhibitor Phase, which was part of the Revelation Space universe, but this one is a standalone, and you can go and read it without any prior knowledge in anything Alastair Reynolds has done. And if you haven't read Alastair Reynolds yet, maybe this is the one that you should start with, because it's fantastic and it does crazy cool things. So, let me give you a few hints, and I'll try to not say anything here that could be considered a spoiler, which is hard to do, because there's certainly some twists and turns in this one. But it's a story that starts out on an early 19th century schooner that was making his way up the Norwegian coast and looking for something. It's on an expedition, and then things take unforeseen turns. And our viewpoint character is the ship's doctor. And yeah, if that sounds already cool, then yeah, go read it. And I'll just say that overall, it's a novel that does a lot of fantastic things for fans of horror, pulp, and other parts of the genre, of what you might call genre fiction. It slips in and out of these kind of different modes of language that you can find in those. If you've ever read some of, like Arthur Gordon Pym by Edgar Allan Poe, or maybe even Moby Dick, or whatever. If you like maritime horror and fantastically maritime stories, this one's for you. If you like pulp stories, this one's for you. If you like serious moral debates in what contemporary genre fiction can do, this one's also for you. And it goes way beyond that. It's an all-over fantastic book when it comes to showing the reader what is possible within the metrics of very, very classic science fiction, or like science fiction adjacent literature that is adhering to genre traditions in a lot of ways and still doing something very, very contemporary, very modern in a lot of ways. And yeah, I don't know. What else can I say without spoiling anything? Go read that book, and I want to talk with you about it, because I need people to talk with me about this. It just made me cry. That's what we're talking about here, right? So go ahead, read that book, come back, and then we'll talk about why this book is so fantastic and what it does in a lot of ways that I personally really, really enjoyed. All right, you're back? Fantastic. Hope you liked it. I certainly did. So, let's try and talk about specifics here. And just go through a bunch of things that I really, really enjoyed about this today, and why I think it is such a fantastic book and such a standout book for what Alastair Reynolds in general does with his craft as a science fiction author. And I think I'll start with that one, and then we'll go into like other aspects beyond that. So I've been a fan of Alastair Reynolds ever since I first read Chasm City in, I guess, 2005 or whenever. So, a long time ago. I've read all his novels, and I like them all. Um, so I feel I have a bit of a grasp on what Alastair Reynolds has always done, and I think this new one, this new novel, Eversion, does a lot of the same things in a more contemporary way, but still adhering to what Alastair Reynolds has always done. So, from where I'm standing, Reynolds' writing have always been very traditional science fiction. It's like I like all kinds of science fiction stuff, and the more like edgy stuff that, for example, people like Cameron Hurley are putting out, or some of the stuff that Lavi Tidar has put out that was more like on the sci-fi side of things, Martian Sands and things like that. Central Station. I like a lot of that more experimental things as well when it comes to science fiction. It's always been something that I feel science fiction has always done well, but I also like maybe some classic sci-fi with, rockets and shit. Your space opera, your hard sci-fi, those kind of things. I still think that the Culture series by Ian M. Banks is absolutely fantastic, and I might still do like a reread of those and talk about them on the channel. And I think what Alastair Reynolds has always done has been like very, very true to those roots of the classic sci-fi, of the classic space opera, of the classic hard sci-fi, depending on where in his novels you are. Like, your Revelation space is a bit more hard sci-fi. Your Pushing Ice is even more hard sci-fi, but it sometimes shifts further into the space operatic kind of stuff. And then there's obviously the Revenger trilogy, or maybe there will be more books. I assume there will be more books in that series. That's just like really cool space pirates and stuff. And this brings me to what I also always appreciate and really respect about Alastair Reynolds' writing is Alastair Reynolds' books have always struck me as written by someone who is aware of the issues, the problems with the tradition of science fiction. The fact that it has been for a long time mostly been written by white men from a mostly Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American, maybe continental Europe, but mostly Anglo-American background, with all the, good and bad things that come with that. And that has oftentimes been just about white men doing heroic things in space and whatnot. And what I've always appreciated about Alastair Reynolds' writings has been that that you can see throughout the books him being aware of those things and consciously moving beyond them, consciously moving into trying to make the whole thing more inclusive, more varied, having more representations of all kinds of other parts of human existence, while still being true, trying to stay true to those traditions that have made classic sci-fi, so much fun for a lot of white men, I guess, like me. And that has been something that we've seen a lot, right? In Pushing Ice, we have two female protagonists, so to speak, right? In, Revelation space is all over the place. But, we have seen these things with the Blue Remembered Earth, the Poseidon's Children trilogy. We see an attempt to move things from that Eurocentric or European-centric kind of settings of science fiction towards Africa as a central part of Earth when we're talking about Earth there. And that's certainly something that I really appreciated. And we have, and including going beyond gender binarity in that series. And it always felt very sincere to me, in a way where I'm like, yeah, that is written by someone who is aware of the problems and is trying to do his damnedest to actually not fall into those, lazy patterns that are so easy to fall into when you're me, for example, a white cis male and rather privileged. And that awareness and the way Reynolds has always tried and has always, in my opinion, succeeded in, on the one hand, moving the genre forward by making it more inclusive and more accessible and more welcoming to non-Anglo-American dudes, basically, while still keeping it as traditional as possible in a lot of ways, is something that I have really, really appreciated. And I think it's something that, we've seen with with the Revengers series about those two sisters, teenage sisters, as main characters and as narrators. That's something that's kind of tough to write as for like a middle-aged white man, I guess. And we see a different approach in this new book that also does some of the same things, and especially in the way it jumps through different narrative styles in different parts of the genre. And this is sort of where I want to go with this as the next part, right? Eversion is, in a lot of ways, a love letter to science fiction in all its older forms. When we start out with that horror bit on the schooner Demeter, the first iteration, so to speak, and then we jump forward to the steamer. And yeah, if you've read like stuff like, as I said, Arthur Gordon Pym by Edgar Allan Poe, and other of those 19th century maritime horror stories, gothic horror stories, so to speak, it's a bit of a love letter to that, and you can see the prose adapted to that and trying to echo or pay homage to the prose you might find in like a 19th century, somewhere between your Edgar Allan Poes and your Arthur Machens and what have you, kind of style. And I think it succeeds. It's really cool in that regard. And then we jump and we're on the steamboat, and it's already something of more of a pulp adventure horror story that you might read from like your 1910s, 1920s kind of stuff. Something that, well, not Lovecraft, but, your probably your 1930s pulp authors could have written in a way, and it kind of changes to that style of narration, or like your later 19th century writers, and it shifts a bit in prose, and it transports the narrative to that kind of subgenre, which is still like an adventure story. And then we move on to the to the full-on pulp steampunk, almost steampunk. Well, it's not steampunk, but you know what I mean. Like your 1930s airship adventure into the Hollow Earth, which is wonderfully done and has all the tropes that you have like from those airship pirates, like airship pirate kind of pulp stories from the 30s and early 40s almost. Yeah, and we once again shift in how to speak. We once again shift our narrative style, the things that are possible, the way the characters are described, the way the prose shift is more of like a 30s, 40s pulp language in that regard. And then we come to those breaks and have, we have the really over-the-top space opera style of the next iteration, like the final iteration, so to speak, of those imaginations of Silas Code. And that's really, it also does the same thing. If you've read like 50s, early 50s, 40s, 50s space opera, classic sci-fi, so to speak, and with all the over-the-top things of the Intergalactic League with blasters and all that, that kind of stuff. And it once again shifts slightly in prose in that regard, and that's fantastic. That's really, really cool and well done. And that's what I mean by making it a love letter to the different phases, the different eras of our genre of science fiction that Alastair Reynolds does there. And then there's like the breaks in the whole thing, the breaks that show this awareness that I really, really appreciated. And that's when we have that first like full-on conversation of Silas with Ada, when she tells him about what is really going on. He's slowly figuring it out, And we have that conversation, and we find out that the captain of the spaceship is in fact female. Just, yeah, but all your dreams were based on these old school narratives that are way too macho, way too masculine, and way too male focused. So you had to gender flip her to actually fit her into that. That's what I mean with like this awareness of like how traditional sci-fi works. It's like, yeah, if reality does not conform to your fantasy, or like science fiction in this case, and you are living in your dreams, you may have to gender flip reality into that fantasy and not the other way around. Which I found a really nice touch, and I really, really appreciated that in ways that, that's really cool. And then it's like those small bits about like the whole actual expedition was funded by, tech bro billionaires trying to prove they're cooler than anyone else. So we have a level of awareness of the current situation, a bit of a commentary basically on our weird billionaire space race from, say, last year and whatnot. So it's current as fuck in that regard, and how it does not really do anything good for humanity, and may even cause harm, because at the end of the day it's very much about like egotistical bastards. And our main character in that regard, Dr. Topolsky, or just Topolsky, is very much annoying because he's only, he's egotistical to like no end, right? In every iteration. And that comment on like what drives people to do specific things and whether those are the right motives or not, I felt that was really well integrated into a book of this length. It's not, too long, and it does a lot of other things around it. But the way it kind of breaks like immersion from one iteration to another, and you start to figure out what is going on, and then you realize where you really are. And I'm like, whoa, that. How did we come from 19th century horror to a very short and very brutal commentary on our current situation in the world? That was like well done once again, which is what I want to go with right now, is like how this book basically comes from a love letter to our genre, and showing off the wonderful facets of all these different older eras of the fantastic or the science fiction side of genre, or speculative fiction. How it does that, while still trying, at the same time showing how science fiction can still be, or is still very much relevant, and is very much about contemporary subjects, with the awareness of how, sexist in a way the genre has been for a while. How so much weird heroics that seem heroic are at the end of the day very much about stroking someone's ego, and how a lot of that can actually lead to a lot of danger, because people who are driven by that kind of motive might just really, not care about anyone who may get harmed in the process, which is, said a lot of times, especially by Topolsky, when he's like, yeah, if we'd all be, serious warriors like the Doctor, we'd never get anything done, so let's ignore things. And yeah, that's certainly something that heroes in books say a lot, but it's only rarely that we figure out and find out that, yes, at least when we read in fiction, they rarely get like the consequences for their actions in that regard. In this book, we get them, sort of. And that's, once again, really well done. It's something that I really appreciated about it. Then we come to the philosophical part of it, and the decision Dr. Silas Code needs to make, right? Which is like, which people have to die and which people have to live. Now, does that sound like something that we all had to deal with too, or we all heard about last 2 years, about making these decisions, these really hard decisions that doctors had to make during a global pandemic, and deciding who has to live to save someone, who has to die to save someone else who is worthy of saving, and who has to, die for the greater good, or, whatever. Yes, we had that recently, and this is once again this is where science fiction can do something wonderful, especially your classic traditional science fiction that has always dealt with these larger problems, these like ethical problems in a lot of ways, and the way we put this into like this weird over the top science fiction setting still makes it very, very clear that the decision that a doctor has to face once triage is on the table is something that is really brutal and that can break someone's mind. That can really break someone's mind. Literally. And having all of that shown to us by the doctor is, once again, it's a really fantastic thing. And shows us how, in a lot of ways, this book is very contemporary. It's very, very right now. It's relevant right now, maybe like a month or 2 months ago, because now we're dealing with like a war in Ukraine and no longer with a pandemic, which will certainly come back. But so we have that part. This is another thing that this book does so wonderfully well. It moves from all the way in the past, the past of the genre, the roots of the science fiction genre, of the speculative fiction genre, with its adventures and its horror elements and all these cool things. And it moves into the present and right now our present day problems. And then it moves into the future and the question of what's a person? What does artificial intelligence truly mean? And the way that is expressed, I found extremely well done, very humbling, because we don't find out that Cytus code is just a piece of software until like fairly close to the end. And yeah, I warned you, this is the spoiler discussion, right? Anyway, so yeah, we don't find out until fairly close to the end. And at that point, we've already gone through, and this is, I think, the strong part here, we've already gone through the whole, like, emotional and moral and ethical dilemma of the doctor, of the triage problem. And then we find out that we're talking about a piece of software that is trying to make this decision. And that does something really interesting there. And there's a bunch of things that are, like, in there right now that I feel are very interesting. One of them is, yes, it's a piece of software. And the question is, like, how can we program a piece of software to do that kind of thing? And the answer is, well, by making it more or less self-aware, and thus truly artificially intelligent. Because one of those problems that's artificial intelligence still faces is obviously the problem of conscience, of consciousness, of self-consciousness, of awareness in a way. And we have no idea how to get there. At least, as far as I know from my times in artificial intelligence, we have no idea on how to make software self-aware, which is the big part. Consciousness is the one thing that we can't really make. Well, in this future, it has been done in a way. But the question is, once that has happened, we can no longer expect software to act in a purely logical way, because that's sort of no longer possible, because personhood and consciousness are, self-consciousness are not necessarily 100% compatible with logic. And the struggles of that, I felt, were like wonderfully handled. And there's like another real like part in there that I think, I don't know if Reynolds thought of that, but it's certainly something that I thought of while reading it. And that's the usual autopilot car situation, right? That whole example of if you have like a self-driving car, and you come into like a traffic situation where the car has to decide where to steer and someone will die no matter what happens. How does that algorithm, in a hypothetically self-driving car that we don't have yet, how does that algorithm decide? What parameters are given to that car and who at the end of the day is responsible, because someone will still die, and who's responsible for that death. It's certainly a question that people that are sort of between, philosophy and ethics on the one hand and computer science on the other hand are very much, concerned about. And the obvious solution here is that we're talking about, well, an autonomous piece of software that makes a decision out of its own personality. And the sad part is, once that is the case, it will probably suffer the same or similar moral breakdowns that humans will suffer in situations where they need to make that decision. So that, I felt, was a really, really intense and, for me, humbling way to actually bring that whole story to an end. And it made me cry for a piece of software. I never thought I would do that. So, well, thank you, Mr. Reynolds, for that. Anyway, it does all of that in a wonderful way. And I think there's a lot to unpack about this book in all kinds of ways. But I think the way it is constructed as a story that goes from the far past of the science fiction genre to the future. We're moving through the present. We're starting with something historical. We're ending up in the future, while dealing, depending on whether we're in the past, the present, or the future, so to speak, dealing with moral questions, societal questions at those different times, questions that we hopefully have sort of already dealt with, gender inequality has been, not fully, alleviated, but we have made progress on that regard already. And that's something that we see in that situation. While on the other hand, the idea of tech billionaires risking stuff for prestige and all kinds of stuff is certainly a contemporary problem that we're dealing with right now. Just as the problem of triage was one that we talked about quite heavily last 2 years. And it's a contemporary problem. And then we move to the future, which is that algorithm problem, how to decide stuff in the future. So how we have a novel that in its settings moves from the past to the future, and in the problems it looks at moves from the past to the future, parallel to that, I felt is a wonderfully well done construction. I really felt that was just wow to me. I think that's one of those things. And it's once again what I meant at the beginning, what Alastair Reynolds does. He shows that you can write a very classic sci-fi tale, which it is. It is very much a classic sci-fi tale with, algorithms making hard decisions and so forth. It's certainly something that science fiction has dealt with ever since the Cold Equation or before, and showing that there are very much different ways to deal with those or move through those questions that science fiction has dealt with before, making them relevant today, making them interesting today, making them humane today, and relevant for the future, showing that classic sci-fi can be done in a sensitive, contemporary way, is the huge achievement of Alastair Reynolds in general. And I think this novel encapsulates that in a lot of ways. And that's just really fantastic. And then there's, of course, the other part, which shows that tales, stories, are kind of universal. Because the story of that expedition gone wrong can be told as an early 19th century horror story, can be told as a more action-packed late 19th century, early 20th century adventure story, can be told as a sort of steampunk, diesel punk, whatever you want to call it, airship story, pulp story. It can be told as a weirdly over-the-top space opera story, and it can be told as a hard sci-fi story, always with the same characters, the same basic characters, just put them in different places, and that's another huge achievement, right? Because at our hearts, we know that we can do that. At our hearts, we know that a story can be translated in time and setting and will still be the same story. We have seen that before, right? We have seen stories like Romeo and Juliet transported into all kinds of weird milieus and stuff. We have seen that before, but like seeing it done with the same story like three, four, 4 or 5 times basically in one novel is really cool. It's really fun. I really appreciated that as well because it shows universality of stories in a way, and that's great. Plus, of course, the argument that if you can gender switch female characters into male characters and the other way around, you can also show that, like, yes, gender is also just a decision. And that's a very, empowering idea, I think. Still, unfortunately, still something that we need to say more often. That gender is a personal choice and not something that has to be in a specific way. So yeah, this is like a really good, really compact, extremely well constructed piece of science fiction that I think, for me personally, ranks really high in Alastair Reynolds' works so far. And this is, of course, because I just, binged it for like 6 hours and I'm very much buzzing with it. But yeah, certainly hit me hard today. And I just wanted to share all of that with you, and I really hope you enjoyed it as well when you read it. And I'd love to talk with you about it in the comments, so please do that. Like, subscribe, if you enjoyed all of that. And yes, please, let's talk about this. I think it's, well, probably my most favorite, like, 22 release so far. Which isn't hard because I don't think I've read any others yet. But yeah, I think it will still remain very high up there at the end of the year. I don't know what else to say. What a blast. Have a great day. See you soon. Cheers.